Hear the presentation from Caroline Harris about her Heled grant. Just a few seconds, I just want to say thank you to Molly Heled Heled Kinberg for allowing this grant to happen. And I'm going to introduce Caroline very quickly. She put a beautiful proposal together to go hiking in Japan and do research on a poet and write about it. So now we're going to hear about her journey. Come on up, Caroline.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. I've always wanted to go to Japan, and I'm so grateful to the Heled Travel and Research Grant for giving me the opportunity to turn my abstract idea into a reality. I want to start by talking a little bit about my application and how I got the idea to go on a pilgrimage across Japan. I'm originally from Northern California, and Japanese culture has had a significant impact on the Bay Area. There's a proliferation of Japanese restaurants, tea gardens, and cultural centers across the Bay. For example, there are Zen centers in San Francisco and at Stanford University. Zen Buddhist monks are trained in both San Francisco and Japan. So growing up, I had family friends who were Zen Buddhist monks. In Ron Salomon's Writing Across Borders, I learned about the cross-cultural literary exchange between California and Japan. As a writer, I was inspired by the tradition of poets who spent time in both places. This includes Zen poets like Gary Snyder and Philip Wallen. These poets went to Japan and became immersed in Zen Buddhism, then returned to San Francisco to spread their teachings. So I was curious to learn more about Japanese literature and culture. For my application, I wrote a personal narrative about how I lived in Switzerland and France for the first 6 years of my life. I went to the French-speaking side of the International School of Geneva, where my siblings and I were the only Americans. I don't remember that much about Geneva, but I know the experience had a deep effect on me. My siblings were older and identify with expats and third culture kids. Both of them went overseas for college. My brother has spent half his life overseas. I don't feel that way. I would say I'm the most American of my siblings, but I do feel rootless and a bit restless. I'm fond of certain places, but I don't feel wedded to one location. I considered how mass restlessness could be a motive for going on pilgrimages. I wondered how many modern-day pilgrims feel as I do, stagnant in one location and happiest when they're in motion. In my application, I pitched the idea of learning what motivates the 21st century pilgrim by following in the footsteps of Matsuo Basho, one of the most famous wanderers. Here's my advice for others who might be thinking about applying. Be yourself, follow your instincts. Write in drafts, give yourself lots of time to edit, and think through how you want to present yourself and your ideas. Your cumulative brain will be more effective than your brain in one sitting. Be specific and precise when describing your proposed project. Show you have thought through the various dimensions of your project and have a cohesive, carefully instructed idea. The more specific, the better. Don't write in generalities and avoid abstractions whenever possible. Finally, be creative and have fun. Now for the moment we've all been waiting for, actually talking about Japan. This past summer, I hiked over 100 miles of the famous Kumano Kodo pilgrimage, beginning in Osaka and ending in Ise. I was researching the haiku poet Matsuo Basho, one of the world's most famous wanderers. I trekked all over Japan, beginning on the Kumano Kodo and concluding with visits to Tokyo, Kyoto, Nikko, Nara, and Iga-Ueno. It was a 3-week-long trip in total. Japan is a fascinating country with a multifaceted history. I loved having the opportunity to learn about Japanese literature and culture firsthand. While in Japan, I had unparalleled access to resources about Basho, from the Basho Museum in Tokyo to the huts in Kyoto where Basho once lived. This is a portrait of Basho. I want to begin my discussion of Basho by defining the Japanese term mono no aware, appreciating the beauty of temporal things. I believe this concept is key to understanding Basho and his poetry. Mono no aware is a melancholy term. It refers to the sweet sadness that comes with acknowledging that everything must die. This concept inspired much of Basho's poetry, which celebrates temporality. The song of a cicada, the moment before a frog splashes into a pond, the beauty of flowers and butterflies over a grave. Because of the brevity of its form, haikus give the impression of only being there for a moment. These are some examples of mono no aware in Basho's poetry. In the cicada's cry, no sign can foretell how soon it must die. Will we meet again here at your flowering grave? Two white butterflies. And now for my personal favorite, the most famous haiku in Japan. The old pond, a frog jumped in, kerplunk. So, who was Matsuo Basho? He was an iconic figure in Japanese literature and culture. He lived during the Edo period, was born in 1644, and died in 1694. He was known for giving haiku its definitive form of 17 syllables, 3 lines, and a 5-7-5 syllabic structure. Basho was also known for perfecting an aesthetic of wandering that was intimately linked with poetry. Basho believed poetry emerged from a flash of insight and its immediate articulation in language. He believed this creative combination could only emerge from wandering. In 1680, at the age of 37, Basho took up a life of wandering, leaving behind the samurai class. He traveled extensively, especially through the wilderness of northern Japan. He reported on his travels in prose poetry accounts, such as Narrow Road to the Interior. After researching Basho, I began planning my pilgrimage. I participated in a guided Walk Japan tour of the Kumano Kodo. Nearly all the signs of the Kumano Kodo are in Japanese, making solo travel as a non-Japanese speaker an iffy proposition. Through Walk Japan, I was paired with tour guides who were fluent Japanese speakers, had lived in Japan for decades, and were Basho scholars to boot. I also wanted context for what I was seeing. Traveling with Japanese speakers provided me with much more access to Japanese culture, along with the discovery of places I never would have gone otherwise, like a Buddhist monastery. I set out to write about poets and pilgrims and about the meaning of Basho's wandering. What was key to my research was accessing the terrain that inspired Basho. I wanted to learn more about his approach to writing poetry and the creativity he derived from wandering. My pilgrimage began in downtown Osaka, where I met my fellow pilgrims for the first time. Over sushi and sashimi, we discussed our expectations for the trek. My fellow pilgrims were, for the most part, married Australian couples in their 60s. I was by far the youngest and also one of the only Americans. They were seasoned hikers, speaking of recent treks across Mongolia, Burma, and Tibet. I asked myself, why so many Australians? There were very few Americans on the Kumano Kodo, but lots of Australians. In general, I saw very few Americans outside Tokyo and Kyoto. I wondered what it is about Australian culture that compels them to wander. I discovered the Australian tradition of walkabouts, a rite of passage in Australian Aboriginal society where Australians undergo a journey of up to 6 months to make a spiritual transition to the next phase of life. Walkabouts are part of the reason why some Australians achieve the reputation of being transients, nomads, or drifters. The term walkabout has gained a negative connotation over time, but it's still a popular part of Australian culture. My travel companions, as I learned, had unorthodox reasons for going on pilgrimages. A pilgrimage is classically defined as a journey in search of moral or spiritual significance. Historically, pilgrims traveled to shrines and other places of religious importance. My fellow pilgrims did not seek spiritual rebirth or religious revelation. Most were inspired by their love of nature and desire for adventure. There were world travelers with a passion for physical activity. The spiritual quest, if any, was one of mindfulness. In the Western world, modern pilgrimages are commonly undergone as part of a meditation and mindfulness quest, or to reconcile major life changes such as death and divorce. In the Eastern world, the term pilgrimage continues to have a more spiritual and religious connotation. So there's the example of the Shikoku Pilgrimage. Compared to the Shikoku, the Kumano Kodo is much less intense. The Shikoku is known in colloquial terms as the death pilgrimage. It's a contemplation of mortality, often undergone by elderly Japanese women right before they pass. The goal of the Shikoku is to surrender into the impartiality of all things, into nature, into the universe, and into natural and spontaneous activity. They visit 88 Buddhist temples on Shikoku, a rugged island in southwest Japan, synonymous with exile in national folklore. Shikoku pilgrims sever ties with their homes and everyday lives. In the words of one priest, to die is to lose everything. The pilgrimage is like virtually dying. You lose everything you have. You leave all your physical and mental baggage behind. With the Shikoku, there's more emphasis placed on becoming henro, or pilgrim, a specific dress of white jackets, prayer beads, name slips, a monk's bag, and a sedge hat. The white jackets, known as hakuai, show the purity of the pilgrim and symbolically represent the pilgrim's willingness to die. The Shikoku is a release of material possessions and worldly attachments, and many die on the trail. The Kumano Kodo, by contrast, is a famous pilgrimage trail, attracting more traffic from tourists than more niche hiking trails. Its broad appeal is as a pilgrimage for everyone, of all ages and backgrounds. It's the most accessible and popular pilgrimage. That's why I chose it. When in Wakayama. My pilgrimage officially started in Wakayama. Wakayama is a Japanese prefecture in the Kansai region on Honshu Island's Kii Peninsula. In Wakayama, ancient pilgrimage routes connect a series of Shinto shrines. More than 100 temples rest among the peaks of Mount Koya, the headquarters of Shingon Buddhism. Wakayama is one of the most spiritually significant and naturally beautiful parts of Japan. It's sparsely populated, mostly mountain villages and countryside towns. As you might imagine, Wakayama is not a popular tourist site as it's very far from Tokyo and Kyoto. Many pilgrimages begin in Koyasan, so while in Koyasan, we saw several Shikoku pilgrims. I want to read an excerpt from my story about my Japan experience, which is forthcoming in the Pennsylvania Gazette. The next morning, we were Koya-bound, shooting through the majestic mountains of Wakayama on a bullet train. My first glimpses of the trail revealed the natural beauty that inspired Basho's belief in nature as the source of man's salvation. The cedars and cypress were intercepted by Buddhist statues, red gates, and bridges that promised the path to eternal paradise. We landed in the mounted temple community of Koyasan. Basho would like this: sun splashes cedar forest, cross of maple spines. We hiked a few miles before settling in at the Buddhist monastery where we would be staying. Monks handed us each a robe, belt, and a pair of wooden slippers. They directed us to the onsens to cleanse ourselves before dinner. I was told that in these communal bathhouses, swimwear was strictly forbidden. I assumed this was a joke, a brand of Australian humor with which I was unfamiliar. It was not a joke. Mortified, I crouched under a shower head, bathing next to women I had known for one day. The notion of appearing naked in front of strangers offended my American prudishness, but one of the Australian women laughed, attributing my shyness to my age. "Just wait until you have kids," she chuckled. Soon, I dropped my robe. I relaxed into what became a repeated experience. I learned to see the onsen for what it was, communal and bonding. Along with eating mackerel for breakfast and sleeping on the floor, I grew to enjoy it. The next morning, we rose at 6 for morning prayer followed by a fire ceremony. The monks chimed gongs and chanted heart sutras in ancestral worship. They burned incense in remembrance of those they have loved and lost. Lips murmuring prayers, they gathered around the fire. After a breakfast of dehydrated vegetables, green tea, and white rice, we began our first full day of hiking. We clutched stamp books, collecting Kumano Kodo memorial stamps from the wooden stands that sprinkle the trail. The Kumano Kodo in Japan and the Camino de Santiago in Spain are the only UNESCO World Heritage listed pilgrimages. Ambitious long-distance hikers can collect stamps on both trails to register as dual pilgrims. I embraced the satisfaction of every stamp. There would be many days of hiking and many physical accomplishments marked in red ink. So I want to show my stamp book. And as you can see, periodically throughout the trail, we would receive stamps to celebrate our accomplishments. And it was extremely satisfying after long days of hiking to be able to celebrate in this way. Everyone got very excited. And then this is an official certification that I completed my pilgrimage. While I set out to research Basho, I became fascinated by Zen Buddhism. And to be fair, Basho was a Zen Buddhist. More than any other school of Buddhism, Zen is concerned with the awakening of awareness to the present moment. It's fiercely disciplined and minimalistic, more concerned with practice than philosophy. Zen Buddhists pursue satori, an experience of the present moment unconditioned by thinking. Zen involves lots of Zen meditation, or zazen, where practitioners sit motionless for hours at a time, pursuing an aha moment. Basho did a lot of this. He used wandering as his moving meditation. He wandered until he arrived at moments of insight and awareness to use for his poetry. I call this photo the Abbey Road of Koyasan. The more I travel, the more I come to understand other countries as a blend of the familiar and the strange. I was struck by the similarities between the Japanese landscape and the landscape of Northern California. Here's another excerpt from my story. The Kumano Kodo felt like home to me. Growing up in Northern California, I grew accustomed to the way sun spills through the slats of redwood trees. During the hikes of my childhood, I stared down at the treetops from mountain summits. I became familiar with the dense green of forests and the dirt path of trails. Nestled in the mountains of Wakayama, I had to remind myself I was no longer in California. Aside from the Japanese trailhead signs and the relative thinness of Japanese redwoods, the terrain was similar. As we drew closer to the Japanese view of the Pacific Ocean, the Australians sang Led Zeppelin's Going to California. I have always been a mountain girl, happiest at elevation, whether in mountains or in snow. I am a certified yoga instructor and have tried all the popular forms of meditation, discovering that nothing is as effective for me as walking. While on the Kumano Kodo, I experienced a quietude and calm. I understood how Basho could spend his whole life like this, roaming among the redwoods. There is something humbling about knowing everything you need can be carried in a backpack. I fell into the rhythm of the Kumano Kodo, lacing my hiking boots every morning with the assurance I was doing exactly what I was meant to be doing. There was a pattern to our days. We rose early, sliding into our robes and wooden slippers for a breakfast of rice and fish. It was silent in the ryokan, save for the chattering of birds. Morning light sliced through the blinds, and I could sense the gentleness of tatami mats under my feet. We trekked up slippery cobblestones to gates shrouded in mist. Backpacks slung over our shoulders, we flitted between conversation and silence as we walked. I became mindful of every footfall. I watched for venomous snakes and Japanese giant hornets, as well as for the more realistic situation of slipping on loose rocks. I reminded myself to look up, to notice the cedar trees washed in silver light and how the redwoods segmented the sky into sections. The trail put on a show for me. Sometimes the mist and rain gave the path an air of the mysterious. Sometimes the stones slickened with moss and my heart lurched, convinced I was falling. While on the trail, I experienced the restorative effects of being in nature. I saw many different views of the trail, in rain and mist, in sunshine, and under blue skies. There are so many spiritual benefits to walking and to being among nature. One element that really moves me about Japanese culture is the reverent attitude toward nature. Many of Japan's temples and shrines are located among trees, moss, and flowers. I love the experience of lacing my hiking boots every morning and knowing I would be among the trees all day. I was on a very early schedule, watching the sunrise. The whole experience was very grounding. While on the trail, it rained about once a week and became very misty, giving the path a mysterious effect, pictured here. The trail was also not without its challenges. On our 7th day, we encountered the Slit Belly hike, so named because people would rather slit their bellies than chart the arduous course. The Kumano Kodo brims with inclines called the Bastards because they seem endless. As soon as you think you've surmounted the steps, more appear. I struggled to adjust to an Eastern diet, especially having fish for breakfast. And yet, I ended each day feeling happy and excited. Situated in the Zen Buddhist tradition, Basho believed in nature as the source of man's salvation. Basho believed that by distilling life to its essentials, he could become one with nature, and therefore the divine. He followed the Zen Buddhist belief that the more natural the spot, the more sacred, and that by becoming closer to nature, one becomes closer to enlightenment. Many of Basho's haikus prominently feature nature, such as this haiku about a cicada, along with the famous frog poem I read earlier. This is a brushwork illustration of Basho's frog poem. Born into a prominent samurai family, Basho left the world of material possessions. By choice, he lived like a lay monk. He shaved his head, wore drab robes, lived in a crude hut, and ate basic food. Many times, he depended upon his disciples for sustenance. They fed, clothed, and housed him during his extensive wandering. These are photos of the hut of one of Basho's disciples in Kyoto, where Basho stayed for many months during a period of wandering. While at this hut, I saw Basho's straw shoes and hat, as well as a cane he may have used. In these photos, you can see some of the kitchen supplies he would have used, as well as the living area with brushwork prints of Basho. Basho lived in thatched roof huts in beautiful spots, surrounded by trees, with many stones to sit on as he wrote his poems. Basho means banana in Japanese. Basho identified with insect and plant life, especially the banana for which he is named. He was a small man of frail health who was happiest in nature. Basho would say things like, "I am humble like the banana." I admire Basho's unassuming personality and uncomplicated tastes. He delighted in simple joys and was easily entertained by bananas. During his wanderings, Basho's disciples frequently housed him, planting banana trees in his honor. Those banana trees still grow today. This is a photo of a banana tree at the hut of one of Basho's disciples. Basho also stayed here. I can imagine him writing haikus under this very banana tree. One of the most memorable parts of my trip was visiting Basho's hometown of Iga Ueno, an area of the Japanese countryside so remote I took 5 trains to get there. I wanted to visit the Basho Museum and the hut where Basho grew up. As you can probably tell, Iga Ueno is an obscure travel destination. It was not marked on any kind of English map. I'm very stubborn, so I insisted on using public transportation despite knowing no Japanese. I didn't encounter any English-speaking tourists using local transportation, so I was on my own. My approach was to match the Japanese characters on Google Maps to the ones I saw on street signs, then hope for the best. I made it to Iga Ueno, which was not a given, and I met 2 girls biking home from school. They actually approached me because they were shocked to see an American wandering the streets of Iga Ueno. They explained in broken English that I was their first American. Because of the language barrier, I kept repeating Basho and making a gesture of a hut with my hands. Giggling, they led me across town, stopping periodically on their bicycles and turning around to make sure I was following them. They kept smiling and saying, "Basho, Basho." Eventually, I made it to the hut. I love the approach of focused travel because if I hadn't been researching Basho, I never would have ventured into Iga Ueno the way I did. It's a town completely untouched by tourism. It was an amusing experience because word traveled fast as the girls told other townspeople about the random American. I went into a store to buy water, and the man behind the counter said gleefully, "You're the American." This is a photo of me and my fellow pilgrims outside an abandoned elementary school in Wakayama. What I took from the trail was becoming more mindful and relaxed. I feel much more connected to nature and more appreciative of the beauty of Northern California. I also became a hiking enthusiast. I loved hiking before, but now I make an effort to hike whenever I'm home. I gained a newfound appreciation for the complexity of Japanese culture. It's difficult to generalize about Japanese culture because so many contradictions and exceptions emerge. So much depends on the region of Japan and the religious practices in question. I visited the massive tourist sites of Tokyo and Kyoto for a contrasting experience to the Kumano Kodo. They were a swirl of history and modernity. Tokyo feels like a technicolor vision of the future, complete with robot restaurants, high-tech hotels, and experimentation with the latest fashion. In Kyoto, the practice of geishas is ongoing, as I learned when I went to buy my grandma a fan and instead stumbled into a geisha house. The geishas thought I was requesting services, but once they learned I was just a clueless American, they rushed me out of the geisha house. It's staggering to me as an American to think about how far back some of these traditions go. While I was in Japan, I was continually reminded by what an ancient society Japan is and the persistence of ancient traditions. At the same time, Japan is at the forefront of new technologies, a fascinating blend of the new and the old. I felt the Kumano Kodo was just the beginning of my larger journey. After the Kumano Kodo, I went on 10-mile hikes in California, as well as on smaller, everyday hikes, striving to be like Basho and appreciate the simplicity and beauty of nature. As my friends know, I'm very into getting my 10,000 steps and can often be found taking the scenic route to class. But on a more serious note, I became a big believer in the transformative power of walking. As human societies have changed and evolved, the ritual of communal walking has remained. We see this in the continued popularity of not only pilgrimages, but also lengthy hiking trails like the Pacific Crest Trail and the Appalachian Trail. For me, walking has become a moving meditation, a time for me to decompress, de-stress, and become more focused to continue with my day. Here's another excerpt from my story. I thought about Basho often. Mostly, I was moved by how he strives for a simple life, the fusion of himself with the trail. I walked for 100 miles to witness the abundance of cedars and cypress, mountains and forests, gates and bridges, sunrises and sunsets. When I arrived in Ise, the sacred city that marked the close of my pilgrimage, I knew my journey had just begun. I dreamed of future treks to Big Sur and Mount Tam, to Muir Woods and Cascade Falls. I dropped my backpack and pulled out my pen. Fair Basho was here, straw shoes passing through the shrine as he journeyed on. I wanted to conclude with a final distinction about pilgrims versus wayfarers. Some would argue Basho was not a pilgrim, but rather a wayfarer. Pilgrimages have a fixed start and end, but Basho's wandering never ended. Pilgrimages are a departure from everyday life, but Basho's wandering was his life. He never assimilated back into the material world, instead opting to permanently live among the plants and insects. He believed his life was a journey that only ended in death. A Basho quote I love is, "Each day is a journey, and the journey itself is home." I concluded the Kumano Kodo with a similar sense that the trek was open-ended and ongoing. Like Basho, I don't feel I ever fully left the Kumano Kodo. The Kumano Kodo stays with me. I think about Japan every day, often several times a day. Like wandering, poetry is open-ended and ongoing. Thank you. Yeah, so questions, anyone? Yeah.
Sorry if you mentioned this, but how long is this is just a quick question, like how long is the pilgrimage from start to end?
So it would take many months to complete the full Kumano Kodo.
Okay.
So I did part of the Kumano Kodo, so I was on the trail for 13 days.
Okay.
And then many people bypass by taking some kind of train or bus, because otherwise it's a very overwhelming experience.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I'm so sorry. Okay, that was delightful. Thank you. So talking of Australians, I was on a trek in Nepal just a few months ago, and I saw predominance of Australians there. And just what the young lady just commented on, the length of your trail. So there were Australians who were spending 22 days to do my trek, and as a typical American, I condensed it to 12 days. And when I would ask for advice on TripAdvisor to how to get the shortest route so I could get back to work on time, I would get very cynical comments, and and they could figure out I was American from my profile in TripAdvisor. So we are not that lucky that way, Our commitments just prevent us from leisurely walking. I mean, it's a trend. I travel a lot. I don't see many Americans, and it's so sad. And it used to be not like this, is what I understand. It used to be Americans were wayfarers in the 60s and the hippie times, I think, is what I understand. So great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi. First of all, that was amazing. And I guess my question would be, what was your kind of like creative process during the whole thing? Because I noticed that you talked about the intersection between poetry and pilgrimage, and I noticed that you kind of like recounted your experiences in a memoir style. So did you kind of write continuously throughout the trip? Like, did you like write poems? And I don't know, what was the kind of like creative process and product, I guess?
Yeah, so I kept a series of notebooks while I was there. So at the end of each day, after our hiking, we would have time in the ryokan to decompress, and I would take that time to write in my notebook, and it would be very much a memoir style of writing. I would write down lifetime observances of what I was seeing. And then I would also write a lot of haikus as I was walking. So I always kept a notebook with me, and then I would occasionally pause and write a haiku about the trees and the moss. And then sometimes even I'd write things on my phone. And then when I was back in California, I compiled all the notebooks that I had and looked at a bunch of pictures and then used that to create my story.
This is like a really small question, but when I went to Japan, I also saw the little like stones dressed in red hats. Like, do you know what that means?
Yeah, okay, so we'll return to that slide. So this links back to Japan's tradition of ancestral worship. So this is supposed to designate the different life phases. So as you can see, some of the stones are a lot taller than others, whereas it's a little hard to see in the photo, but some are just mounds of rocks or rock piles, and that's supposed to signify death. So it signifies every phase of the circle of life, and then also pays respect to the ancestors. I hope so. So I'm hoping to go on a circumnavigation of Ireland this summer via sea voyage. So I was thinking that perhaps I can become a travel writer and compile all these experiences.
Really amazing journey. I was just wondering, was there ever a day where you were low energy, where you're like looking at from the base of a trail and just saying, I don't know if I can do that? Did you ever just feel like quitting at any moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had one day in particular where I was feeling very low energy. I had a lot of trouble adjusting to the Eastern style diet, as I mentioned earlier. So I actually had a bit of a diva moment where I asked if I could have a Western style breakfast, and I felt so guilty about that, but my body was just not doing well with the constant fish and rice. And then after that, I was feeling a bit grumpy, and I was texting my friends all day, and I was not at all paying attention to the trail. But I just remembered to be patient with myself because traveling's up and downs and it's not going to be a consistent highlight reel. So I felt a lot better after taking that one day to be a little grumpy.
Yeah, kind of on that note, so like I've done a bit of solo travel in the past as well, and it, like you said, it's like not really always a highlight reel, and sometimes there are moments of like extreme loneliness, or like where you feel like very poignantly the fact that you are alone in a foreign country. Did you feel that at all, or was it kind of dominated by the fact that you felt very like in touch with nature or the people there, etc.?
Yeah, so with the structured guided tour, that really helped combat my loneliness because I was constantly surrounded by very gregarious Australians, and they kind of treated me. They kind of treated me like their daughter, and they were very maternal, and it was very sweet. Yeah, in terms of isolation and loneliness, it definitely helped to text my friends a lot and to feel connected to them in that way. And then also, because I'm obviously a white American, I couldn't very easily blend amongst the people in Japan. And so then tourists would approach me, and I would have like kind of a community of other Americans and Australians who would immediately come up to me and be very friendly.
Hi, I was just wondering, like, what was the thing that most, like, surprised you, or, like, expectations you had that, like, didn't, you know, like, turned out differently than you, like, expected?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time in cities, and I was completely shocked when I was in Osaka and also Tokyo by how clean all the streets are, and there's no trash anywhere, but then there are also no trash bins. So as I learned, it's very common when you live in a city to carry essentially a plastic bag in your backpack and hide all the trash. So you see no evidence whatsoever of like any kind of dirt or dishevelment. And then there are also no homeless people. And so I was so shocked to see like such a clean city. And then it was also a little creepy because it seemed a little too orderly and a little too perfect. So it took me a while to adjust to that.
So, how do you think like not understanding the language impacted your ability to like feel a sense of wonderment, or like just basically how did it affect your like pilgrimage?
Yeah, so my ideal would have been to do an unguided solo tour of the Kumano Kodo, but that was very unrealistic because of the language barrier and because the Kumano Kodo goes through very remote areas of the Japanese countryside where no one speaks English. So I think that in an ideal world, I would have been able to immerse myself in the Japanese language beforehand, gain a certain level of fluency, and then done a non-guided tour and have it be an entirely solitary experience, because that's more true to the spirit of a pilgrimage, where it's supposed to be more individualistic. So I would say that was both a pro and a con, because I also had this more collective experience with all the Australians, but then that took away a bit from my internal reflections. Yeah.
What do you think do you think going to Tokyo after this trail affected how you thought about it, and then now you think about it in a way?
Yeah, I would say it provided such a sharp contrast, because it would be common on the trail to not see other people outside of our tour group for days on end, and would be staying in these places that felt very insular and very separated from any kind of bustling metropolis. And then Tokyo makes New York look like very provincial and very small. It's completely overwhelming. There are lights everywhere, so many people. It's like Times Square on steroids on every block. So that was so overwhelming after this experience of being very much among nature. So I would say that gave me a further appreciation for how complicated Japanese culture is, and how it depends so much on where you're going and what region you're in terms of what the experience is going to be.
Also, do you think when you're walking in the trail and you're walking in a city, I mean, they're both, I think, very naturally walking environments kind of in a way. So do you think there's kind of even a meditative process of walking in cities, even when we're walking on campus? Do you think that also has the same kind of meditative note we can think about in our daily lives?
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's more of a mindset than anything else. So you can achieve the same kind of benefits on either terrain, depending on what your internal focus is like. I would say that being in a very solitary, nature-filled environment lends itself more to that kind of calm and restorative reflection, but it can be achieved in a city as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, this question's kind of similar to that, but as a writer, did you find your writing process different when you were out in nature and on this pilgrimage versus as a student being in a city, or having to work in an office and typing just at a computer?
Yeah, I completely understood why Basho would decide to go on this kind of journey and wandering when I was there, because I was so much more productive, I was so much more inspired, and there were so many fewer distractions, because I would often be sitting in these solitary rooms where it'd be just me and my notebook, and I would have no other external stimuli, so to speak. So it was a lot easier to focus on my writing.
I wanted to compliment you on going to Iguanueno by yourself. That was an adventure, but I guess I'm having two different views of technology. One, if you didn't have access to Google Maps, you probably wouldn't have reached that destination, or not as easily. But you also mentioned that if you could do the journey solitarily, that would have maybe been a more authentic experience. But then, does that mean you wouldn't, in other words, like you said, the one day when you were having a down day, you chatted with your friends.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm seeing it from two different points of view, well, we shouldn't have any cell phones with us at all if we really, truly want to experience it. But then it was a necessity since you didn't have the language proficiency. So,
Yeah, that's a really good point. I would say it would be impossible to do it as a solo experience without knowing the language and without technology, because with technology, it would be things like I would Google a certain restaurant and show the Japanese characters on my phone to someone I saw in the street and then be able to direct me in that way. Or I would get into a cab, and the only way that I would be able to get to my hotel or where I was staying was through showing the Japanese address on my phone to the person in question. So yeah, I would say that while people like to criticize technology, one real pro is when you're traveling with a language barrier and you can have that as a way to translate.
is there any Wi-Fi? If you went on the journey, I forget the name, Shofu or Shobu?
Oh, Shikoku. Yeah.
Sorry, Shikoku. Really close. Okay, Shikoku. Would there have been a Wi-Fi there? In other words, you can't be too remote and not have Wi-Fi in Japan.
Yeah, so Japan is really amazing in that I never had any problems accessing Wi-Fi, no matter how remote the region. But with the Shikoku, I thought about doing the Shikoku, but it's such an immersive experience and that you're so separated from technology, and the idea is that you have no access to technology whatsoever. What was that?
Shikofu?
Shikoku.
You're required to leave your cell phone at home?
Yeah, that's the expectation. And then it's also an expectation that it be multiple months and that it be self-organized and solitary. So I would say it's next to impossible to complete the Shikoku as a non-Japanese speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I think
Oh,
that
thank
wraps
you.
us up, but I think there's still pizza, so if people want to continue to talk, we can move into the other room. That was a terrific thing. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.